You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYSHAX.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how you doing?
Hey, y'all.
Where are you calling in from today?
Today I'm still in Denmark, but I'm on my way going down to Germany for some meetings down in Hapag-Lloyd headquarters.
Amazing. How long is the drive to get there?
From here, it's about 5 hours down to Hamburg.
Okay, pretty decent drive. All right, well, we've got a good amount of material to get through today, so maybe we just jump into it. Can you tell me the latest on the market?
Now, obviously, I think what everybody wants to hear about is this morning's news that there is now a ceasefire in the trade war between US and China. But that's a bigger topic, and let's get to that one towards the end of the podcast to award it the time it deserves. So turning our eyes slightly away from the US markets, it's actually interesting to look at some of the data that just came out from Container Trade Statistics. I mean, these are the guys that have the most comprehensive global demand data, and they come out every month. And they came out with the data for March. Now, importantly here, they measure a time of loading. So this is all cargo loaded during March, so prior to the trade war. And global demand is still up around 6.5% on a year-on-year basis. And that actually doesn't matter whether I measure it in TEU or in TEU miles. So for the month of March, global demand growth was still holding up solid, seen as an average. There is a twist, though, that's extremely important to note. If I look only at the major head haul trades, so Asia to North America and Asia Europe and Europe to North America and so on and so forth, all the main directions, the head haul trades grew almost 9%, whereas the back haul trades combined declined marginally by 0.1%. And that's actually the third consecutive month we've seen this pattern. So head haul trades are growing solidly, back haul trades are actually declining. This overall means larger trade imbalances on all trades. It means, on average, more need to reposition empty containers. And if you think that one through, the longer this continues, the more fragile the ecosystem is going to be in terms of, do you have the right containers in the right place? Or at least it raises the bar for the importance of getting empty containers moved around. So that's more of a twist in the data. The overall demand situation, at least for cargo load in March, was solid demand growth, more or less across the board. And of course, with solid demand growth, it begs a question. Because if you look at some of the different indices out there, not the NYFI, doesn't cover Asia Europe yet. We'll get to the NYFI in a moment. But if you look at some of the other indices on Asia Europe, you actually see quite a steep continuing decline of rates from Asia to Europe. And in that sense, that might seem counterintuitive because we have definitely solid demand growth also on Asia to Europe, bordering also on the 9 to 10% range. So why are rates continuing to drop? And the key here is capacity. Because year on year capacity in April between Asia and Europe is up around 20%. And you say, why on earth are the carriers putting that much capacity into the Asia-Europe market? Well, first of all, we still had the change over to all new alliances. That in itself ended up with services with slightly more capacity. But if we think back a year ago, you still had a vast range of blank sailings, partly because the carriers didn't have enough ships. Remember, a year ago, this was still early days during the Red Sea crisis, and the carriers were trying to make ends meet, but didn't quite have enough ships to have everything go around Africa. It seems now they have, for two different reasons. One reason is a lot more ships have been delivered. That's the obvious one. But here comes the less obvious one, the US-China trade war. Because the US-China trade war, as we talked about last week, has led to a very sharp increase in blank sailings on the Pacific. And if you're blanking a lot of sailings on the Pacific, what do you do with the ships? Well, if you've got gaps in other services, you can ad hoc use these ships to phase them in and maintain your services over on, for example, Asia Europe. So it's one of these things where, counterintuitively, the trade war on the Pacific seems to have as a side consequence a further weakening of market conditions on Asia Europe, despite an actual strong demand development. So it's one of these quirks where everything seems to be connected.
So it's just a matter of getting that balance right, of meeting that increase of demand but not exceeding it. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is exceeding to some extent.
It takes time to get the balance right. This is not something you can do at a whim from one week to the next. This takes a long time to carefully balance. And when we have changes in the market that happens almost on a daily basis, this becomes extremely difficult to control.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors right now playing into it, so I can imagine it's a little bit of like throwing darts and trying to get where you want it to go, but even if you know where you want it to go, it's not always right.
It is, and you could say it might be the wrong metaphor in this case, throwing darts, but let's play with it anyway, because what are some of these black swans? One of them we talked about last week, and now we begin to see the ramifications. That's I'm not sure we should call it a war just yet, but the skirmish between India and Pakistan. And again, it's one of these that shows the interconnectivity here, because India and Pakistan are to a large degree serviced either through transshipments, typically in places like Jebel Ali or Colombo or Salalah around the region, or increasingly by direct services. But a lot of these direct services tend to call ports, at least if you are on the Indian west coast, they call some of the major Indian ports as well as the large ports in Pakistan. What has happened with the skirmishes between India and Pakistan is right now it is forbidden for a shipping line to pick up containers in Pakistan and have them on board if you want to call an Indian port. Doesn't even matter if they're empties. If I pick up empties in Karachi port, I cannot call Mundur port, for example. That is a major issue for a liner shipping service that calls all of them. If you look at, for example, CMA CGM the last couple of days, they have announced that they are starting a new specific service that only calls Pakistan. It then calls the hubs in Jebel Ali and in Colombo. And then they have a range of other services that used to have calls both in India and Pakistan. They're now only calling India. So the ramification I'm seeing here is India remains relatively well connected on the services that they are used to, clearly because they are a larger market than Pakistan. Pakistan, on the other hand, is getting the short end of the stick because it appears now that a lot of their direct services are disappearing and are being replaced with transshipment services. And this is going to be transshipments, as I mentioned, in places like Jebel Ali, Colombo, maybe Salalah for some of the other carriers as well. But if you then increase the volumes in these transshipment hubs, that can impact your service integrity on the main east-west trades. Colombo is also a key hub on some of the other major services going east to west. So it's again one of these where we have a development which appears localized to India and Pakistan, but it could, I'm not saying it necessarily will, it's a matter of how long it lasts, but it could lead to increased congestion issues in some of the key hubs in Asia. This is not to be underestimated because remember last year when peak season started, we actually had major problems in key hubs in the Middle East. At that point in time, it was a consequence of the Red Sea crisis. So the India-Pakistan situation warrants a close monitoring from the perspective this could impact key hubs in Asia.
Are there any steps that shippers should take if they're importing from Pakistan or India?
Well, if they're importing from India, I mean, they should still double check, but it appears most of them will have access to the Indian import-export services that they're more or less used to. There might be a little bit of changing on timing. For importers and exporters to and from Pakistan, they definitely need to be on top of this because there's a high likelihood that the services they're used to will actually not be operating, and they need to now move on other services instead.
Okay, good to know. All right. Should we switch over to the latest NiFi rates?
Yes, absolutely. We're getting the weekly numbers on what is actually being paid for the cargo moved. And this is where we look at over the last 2 years. This is the extent of the data where NiFi has data ranging in, also to give everyone a feel for what has happened. I think as everybody is well aware, the overall conceptual development here is what everybody is more or less familiar with. We had the peak last year. Now, note this is Pacific, right? But we had the peak as the peak season kicked off early last year. Then we had the very large peak during the normal peak season. We had a usual seasonal downturn. We had another peak coming up on Chinese New Year. And then, of course, we had quite a significant reduction in freight rates as we got past the Chinese New Year peak. And at this point in time, part of this, as I think I've alluded to before, is likely due to the carriers not blanking because they were phasing in new services. And now watch what has happened over the last 4 weeks, coming into April and early May of 2025. First, we actually saw a slight bump in rates. I think part of that was driven initially, even before the reciprocal tariffs were going to kick in. If we think back to April 2nd, when Trump announced all of these reciprocal tariffs, they were only going to come into effect really from April 9th. So there was this tiny window that caused quite a push of cargo. Anybody that had cargo available, push it through before April 9th. Then after, there was a 2-day window where nothing moved, but then very quickly, reciprocal tariffs were put on pause for 90 days, causing another surge from non-Chinese origins, but not from Chinese origins. And I think this has created that artifact. If you drill further into the numbers, we will also see some pretty big shifts in the offset between what are ex-China rates and what are rates out of, for example, Southeast Asia and some of the other corridors. What I think is also worthwhile noting is there's always, we have two graphs here. The upper line is the price for a 40-foot container. The lower is for a 20-foot container. And what is interesting to note is just how narrow that gap has become in recent weeks. And again, I think the trade war is part of the reason for this. Let's keep in mind, cargo from Asia to US tend to be light cargo. This is consumer goods. They are bulky, but they are not heavy. They all tend to move in 40-foot containers. 20-foot containers, that's what we want for the US exports. There's a lot of US agricultural exports. They are heavy. They require 20-foot containers. From a carrier perspective, I would be very hesitant to book cargo on 20-foot containers from Asia to US because right now US agricultural exports to China has come to a standstill because of the Chinese retaliatory tariffs. So from a carrier perspective, if I'm going to move a 20-foot into the US, I can sort of understand why I would want almost the same price as a 40-foot because from a carrier perspective, I'm unlikely to be able to fill it going back.
Lars, what's the difference there where you have, like, either way, the container has to go back, right? So does it matter that much?
Yeah, because again, at the end of the day, it's a matter of cost. And from a cost perspective on the carrier, I'm going to pay for a load on, load off. It's going to cost me the same no matter whether it's a 20 or a 40 foot. A lot of the costs for the carriers operationally are the same, irrespective of whether it's a 20 or 40 foot.
Okay.
And that, of course, brings us back to where we started the conversation here today. Now what? What about this seeming new agreement that has been announced between US and China in terms of the trade war? So if we start to try to, I was about to say drive down that rabbit hole, but it's not that much of a rabbit hole. It's more a matter of looking at what are the dominoes that we know are going to fall. Because this is not so much a matter of predicting what will happen in the future. This is a matter of simply saying this is what will happen. If we take the facts first, the fact is there's been an announcement, a joint announcement between US and China that most of the reciprocal tariffs are on a 90-day pause. That means that China still has a 10% tariff on US imports, and US still has a 30% tariff on Chinese imports. From the US perspective, the 30%, that is the 20% that was initially called a fentanyl tariff, and then the 10% that's basically slapped on the entire world. From a Chinese perspective, the 10% was the retaliation to the US 10%. China never retaliated against the fentanyl so-called tariff. So it's 10% versus 30%. And everything else, so the 145% stuff, that's all on pause for 90 days. That's it. There has been plenty of headlines to the effect that now there is a major trade deal between US and China. Objectively, that is simply not true. There is not a trade deal. The only deal that has been announced right now is basically this postponement of 90 days of the tariffs. That's it. That's all that it is. And that means we can already now, with an extremely high degree of certainty, say what is then going to transpire in the coming weeks and months. So if we take into account what is already happening, what is already happening is this week you're seeing a massive decline in the amount of vessels arriving into the US West Coast. That, of course, is a consequence of what happened 3 weeks ago. And that also means that we will continue for the next 3 weeks to see a massive decline in vessel arrivals, a massive decline in volumes clearing customs into US because these are ships that have already left Asia. This is for sure. No matter the ceasefire that was agreed in the trade war, that decline will continue for the coming 3 weeks. What will now also happen in the coming weeks, there is a literal mountain of cargo in China waiting to be shipped. As tariffs were suddenly ramped up to 145%, most US importers took the view of saying the best strategy is wait and see. So all the ones that did have cargo ready in China, it was already loaded into containers in some cases. They've all been in a holding pattern. So all that cargo is now awaiting shipments. So to the degree that the vessels are available over in Asia, let's return to that argument a little bit later, but to the degree vessels are available, you are over the next 1 to 2 weeks going to see a proverbial tsunami of cargo leaving China going towards US. This cargo will then hit the US West Coast 4 to 5 weeks from now, and the US East Coast 6 to 7 weeks into the future from now. This very much is a replay of the early part of the pandemic. So what you're going to see in the US ports, again, the US West Coast will see it first, so 4 to 5 weeks from now, you're going to see a situation where we go from half-empty ports to ports that are very likely to get congestion problems, because suddenly you get this massive array of cargo. A port works best if you got an even flow. If I'm handling 200,000 TEU every week just fine, that's okay. But then having 1 week with 0 and 1 week with 400,000, I can't handle the 400,000. It's that simple. So there are going to be elements of congestion. And that congestion is not just a port issue. Remember, this is going to hit chassis availability. It's going to hit trucks. It's going to hit rail. This is not so much a crystal ball prediction. It is simply an operational reality that will happen from all the cargo that's already ready to be loaded over in China. Once that cargo is loaded, what is the next thing that's going to happen? The next thing that's going to happen is US importers, they will very likely place large orders and pressure the manufacturers in China to produce as quickly as possible. Because most importers will look at this and say, well, 90 days, that is until 14th of August. So I need to move all my peak season cargo prior to August 14th, because we don't know whether the tariffs will be reinstated again or not. The only precedence we have here is the play out we saw between US and then Canada and Mexico earlier in the year, where tariffs were also placed on pause for 30 days, trying to come up with a new agreement. And after the 30 days, there was no new agreement, and the tariffs were then re-implemented. So that's, of course, the concern. So on the Trans-Pacific, there are now 2 deadlines. One deadline is July 9th. This is where the reciprocal tariffs could come back into force for all the other Asian countries, and now also August 14th, where it could come for China itself. All of this points to an onset of a peak season also out of China. Right now, that peak season is going to be sharp and it's going to be short, again fueling further risks of port congestion in US ports about a month down the line from now. But this then begs 2 other questions. Do we actually have the ships and empty containers available in China to handle this? In terms of the ships, in the very short term, that might be questionable, because remember, the carriers have just announced a whole raft of blank sailings. So now they're going to have to do a double take and quickly reinstate the services they have already blanked. To the degree those vessels are just lying idle, that can of course be done quickly, but some of these vessels are not lying idle. They have been used to phase in and plug holes in some of the other parts of the network, such as the Asia-Europe network. That could prevent them in the extreme short term, here I'm talking over the next week, for example, to actually handle the flow. That's going to create quite an upward push on freight rates. But the next thing I expect to happen then is you're going to see now an increase in blank sailings on Asia-Europe. Remember what I said before, Asia-Europe rates were under pressure. There's too much capacity. Now this is the golden solution for the carriers. They will blank a lot of sailings on Asia-Europe for vessels that are already in Asia, and then use these vessels to phase in or use as extra loaders for cargo from China to the US. And again, here we see a replay of the pandemic situation. Everyone will be scrambling to get cargo out of China as soon as possible. The carriers will try to comply with that request, and the inevitable result will be congestion in US terminals a month down the line. It's one of these where that's not really a good solution, because what do you want the carriers to do? Do you want the carriers to tell the customers that want to ship cargo, say, you know what, I'm going to keep my vessel idle and not move your cargo because that way I can prevent port congestion? That would be seen as some sort of collusion to keep capacity out of a market where we want to move cargo. So part of this congestion is inevitable. The next thing that's going to happen, I would say that is now about 4 to 5 weeks into the future. All these blank sailings that are right now arriving in the US over the next 3 weeks, that of course will lead to blank sailings from US back to China. Obviously, the vessels are not arriving. So the ability of the carriers to move empty containers from US back to China will be severely curtailed over the next 3 weeks because of all the blank sailings for ships that never left Asia in the first place. So 4 to 5 weeks from now, we are not going to replenish the empty depots in China as much as you could reckon on. And 4 to 5 weeks from now, we are likely in full force of a peak season where everybody is trying to move cargo prior to the 90-day cutoff on the tariffs. So you're going to see a two-step impact now on spot rates. In the short term, it's going to be pressure to get cargo moved on the ships. And I would say 4, 5, maybe 6 weeks into the future, you're going to see an upwards pressure again on spot rates, this time for a fight over equipment. This is all a replay of the exact same dominoes we saw during the pandemic phase. There's not really much of a difference here.
Where are the empties right now that were in China that, didn't sail to the US because of the blanks?
Some of them are actually filled with cargo awaiting shipments. Because remember, a lot of the factories didn't actually stop over the last 4 weeks. It's just a matter that the cargo was held back, as a lot of the importers were playing a wait-and-see game.
Okay. So there's not necessarily a lack of containers there currently, but you're going to see some issues moving forward.
That's the concern. And you say all of these, as I said, are relatively easy to forecast because these are simply dominoes, one tipping the other one over. The unknown part here, of course, is will there be a more lasting trade agreement, not just between US and China, but also between US and all the other Asian countries? We don't know. A best case scenario, which we should hope for, is that there is actually a trade agreement. And if there is a trade agreement, that means the uncertainty of the 90 days goes away. That's basically what it will mean. And that would be a positive impact. Because if a real trade deal can be announced in the short term, where it's clear what the landscape will be going forward, that takes away some of the urgency to move everything within these 90 days. That could prolong the peak season, take the edge off it. That would be beneficial to the supply chain. But right now, we simply don't know whether such an agreement will be made or not. On a more general note, typically it takes years to negotiate trade agreements. The reason being these are usually documents thousands of pages long. There's an enormous amount of detailed work that goes into these. It is difficult to see solid trade agreements be negotiated in a matter of weeks. So far, we've seen the US announce 2 so-called trade deals. One is the one we just talked about now, China-US, which really isn't a trade deal. It's a ceasefire in the trade war. That's the only thing it is. And then there was the announcement of the trade deal between US and the UK, which again, there is not a signed document. There's not really a trade deal. What the reality is, the deal between US and UK is effectively a deal to continue negotiating a trade deal, hopefully with details coming over the coming weeks and months. But there is not a trade deal as such. Again, usually these things take a lot of time to work their way through the system.
And what happens for any importers that have already brought in cargo or it's about to arrive? Are they still subject to the really high tariff rates?
That is a good question. Strictly speaking, nobody will know right now because we again need to separate between what is being said politically, in this case by the US government, and what is actual law. And until there's something that comes out in the form of an executive order or in the form of legislator that goes in to customs legislation, these are just political statements. So for now, those political statements are just saying that as from May 14th, these tariffs are on pause. That's it. That's all we know. And if that is all we know, that also implies this is not retroactive. That would imply that cargo that's been shipped prior might actually be subject to the high tariff. But we factually don't know until we see more details of what it is US and China have actually agreed. And those details come out in a form that's actually legally binding and not just political rhetoric.
Yeah. Yeah, we're filming this Monday morning, 9 o'clock Eastern time. And I think this news broke like overnight.
It broke overnight, and that's also why I say the only thing we have for now is that political talk. If anybody wants to read the details, it actually has a fact sheet on the White House webpage, where again you can see that yes, it's an agreement to basically postpone these tariffs 90 days, and that's it. That's all that's been stated so far.
Okay, so I'm sure we'll see more details in the coming weeks or so.
Yeah, at least what shippers should be looking for is details that comes into the Federal Register or through an executive order to say now this is binding, so they actually know this is real and that they know whether or not this retroactively impacts cargo that's already on the ships. And if they have any doubts, I am not a customs broker specialist. I would certainly urge everyone with that question to contact their customs broker.
That's good advice. Not a lawyer, just pretend to be one on TV. All right. Well, I think that's everything for today, unless you have some closing thoughts here.
No, and I think things are moving extremely fast out there. So I think my closing thoughts here should be for everyone. Make sure you understand the difference between what is being said politically of statements, not just from the US government, but also from other governments in terms of the trade war, and what is actually being put into implementable law, because we are increasingly seeing a discrepancy between the two. And for importers and exporters and other participants in the supply chain, it's of course what is signed into law that matters. It doesn't matter what politicians would like to see happen. It matters what is actual law when it comes down to how much you're going to pay or not pay.
Yeah, it's good advice. It's definitely important, especially if you're making crucial business decisions, to make sure that you have all the facts and that you're fact checking what you do here.
And you can say, for anybody else out there, I mean, get ahead of this freight train. Already now start preparing for, if you are now fast tracking cargo to move it into the US, do not take for granted that you can secure access to chassis, to trucks, to rail, to warehousing capacity, basically every aspect of capacity that became scarce during the initial pandemic disruptions. Expect to see the same emerge 4 to 6 weeks from now in the US.
Yeah. Reach out to your truckers. Be a good partner to them. Let them know what's coming. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the updates today, Lars. For all of our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back here next Monday with more updates. So stay tuned.
Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.